There's also information through the intranet. We've been trying to up that usage to push information out, and now since the reorg, probably since the reorg, they've been doing a weekly update of any program that wants to give updates about what's going on in the library. They push that out every Friday. So they're making an effort to put communication at the forefront, and I think we appreciate that. As far as where we were in the reorg process and what decisions were made, there was never any real direct consultation with LAUC, where they sat down with librarians and said, what do you think about this idea, or what are your opinions on this? There was a survey that went out a while ago where everyone in the library got to write their top choices of what types of things they'd want to do, but I've heard various and wide rumors that those were never fully distributed to everyone, and maybe there was actually certain rules they were breaking with the union and asking librarians certain things, and so it was an odd process. They were attempting to get feedback and personal opinions, but they never guaranteed that you'd get what you want anyway, and then I'm not sure they even told everyone. It was odd. And it was concerning in a way, because you're suddenly being asked what you want to do, and then so it makes you think about, am I going to get this? Am I going to get that? What are they going to do with me? And so it was a very odd time, those few months before the big reveal day, when everyone got an email saying this is what your new assignment is. And that probably was the time when, looking back, it might have been nice to have a bit more of a presence in their discussions. Considering, as Cristela mentioned, some of the issues that have come up, especially with the split assignments that we're backtracking now. And I do think that I tend to take a positive look on things, and if you have maybe a less desired position, like I happen to be happy with what I got, but some people might not be, and they might have a different opinion than I do. But I think that the UL and AULs are making an effort to listen at this point and kind of backtrack a little bit. So I'm going to talk about that in more detail right now. As Cristela said, it's functional based instead of department based or discipline based. And when I started a few years ago, the Science and Engineering Library, we had our own, just for example, because that's where I was, we had our own ILL, we had our own circulation, we had our own reshelving, we did everything kind of internally, we had our own instruction, et cetera, et cetera. And part of the idea of coming together is to reduce some of those redundancies. And so they made ILL centralized, they made circulation centralized, and now they've made instruction centralized, for example, and reference. And there's good ideas behind that, but one thing they kept was a liaison program. And in the duties listed under a liaison, it said you will do subject-based reference and instruction and outreach, and yet there's an instruction program and a reference program. And the first question I think everyone, at least for me, was, well, where does this stop and where does that stop? And where does my duties fall and what program? And if you have a certain percentage here, a certain percentage there, what does that mean? And that's been the biggest sticking point with librarians, especially liaison or subject specialist librarians, as to how that all really needs to work. And so what the first thing that LAUC did was to look at our ARPM, which is our manual on how we do retention, promotion, and so forth. Because as this happened in the summer and the review process was starting soon, we needed to kind of figure out how we were going to handle this. Now that, for example, I have 3 programs that I report to, a 50%, 30%, 20% split. Many subject librarians were like that. What are those reporting lines? How do they inform my review? And what's the process there? Obviously a big question, and one we needed to kind of figure out. And so LAUC, along with the AUL for Enterprise Services, who oversees HR, we formed a committee, and I got to be the chair of that little committee, because I was the chair of LAUC at the time, or just finishing. We kind of sat down and said, how do we want to handle this? Partly, we changed the names for everything, so the entire manual needed to kind of be cleaned up to change all the names. But the big question was, how do we do our reviews? It was interesting because from both management level and librarian level, I heard both sides in terms of getting input. We said, we really ought to have one reporting line, and everyone does have a main program, that's your primary reporting line. But what to do with these ones we started calling secondary, where there was a smaller percentage. Some people said, no, I just want one person that I can report to, that knows my job, it's just simpler, easier. Other people said, well, what about the work I'm doing over here? If this program director doesn't know what I'm doing, am I going to get enough input? Is it going to look like I did anything? Are they really going to be able to give a good description of what I'm doing? Same thing with managers. Some said, I don't want to deal with, for the collection department or the liaison who had 15 to 20 librarians with a 10%, 20% in their program, how am I gonna give input to all of those? Whereas other people said, but if I don't, what if they're doing a poor job in my department? How do I give that input? What if that never comes up? So it was an interesting balance, and it was that we took a vote eventually after a lot of discussion, and it came down very closely to saying what we're going to do is have the main review, reporting line is going to do the write-up as we normally do it, but that every other official reporting line will submit a 1 page or less, was the idea, of a report of how they've done in the last reporting time period. And of course, this was also exacerbated by the fact this was only really 6 months, because people that were up for their first review, and then the rest of their time was all your last department head, and it's been a lot of fun. So what happened with that is we're coming out of our first review cycle, as we all are, and there was a lot of lessons learned. And I'm actually really interested, because I get to do this all again this summer, to redo it because of the changes in the MOU. Also kind of throws the thing out the window. We decided not to tackle that at the same time. But we're going to review this again, and I'm really curious to see what CAPA recommends. Partly because over time we've been trying to reduce the number of letters that people ask for, the number of input that people ask for the review files, because it just makes a lot more work that's often not necessary. But this process created a lot more work. There were a lot of misunderstanding or misconceptions about what was really needed. What do you need from me? There's a lot more communication that has to happen. I need 5 letters from this person. I need 3 letters from this person, this person, this is it. It just adds to everything. And so there's going to be a re-review of this coming up real soon, and write this over again. It's been, I think, the #1 challenge from a LAUC standpoint, where we have direct involvement. The other thing, very similarly on the same topic, is because of this transition status check came out of that, was a lot of pushback, and as Cristela said, the biggest thing were these split assignments, and they're seriously reconsidering giving percentages, like actual percentages. It just made a lot more work than was necessary, and a lot more discontent, I think, because suddenly if I have 20% here, when do I have to give that 20%? How do I give that 20%? Do they know I'm giving 20%? What does that look like? And it kind of ate away at the professional nature of our job, where we kind of know how to handle a certain percentage. No one's really fighting against the fact that we have split jobs. We know we do instruction and reference and outreach and collections, depending on, every single person does that, but that's not what we're fighting against generally. And we're not fighting against multiple subjects for most of the time, that people have multiple subjects. It's really just how the administration of this is done. It's a very difficult thing to find the right balance, I think. And so that's what UCSD has been struggling with. And there's been a lot of open discourse and town halls, and they haven't officially banned the percentages, although it seems to be in the works. It doesn't mean we're not going to still report to different programs, though, and how that's really going to shake down will remain to be seen. Along with how communication goes and how emails go, and the number of meetings that are now, if you report to 3 or 4 programs, you have way more department meetings. It's interesting. It has taken time to settle down and to kind of find the rhythm. It hasn't completely found any rhythm yet, some rhythm. And I think people are kind of getting a feel for their roles a little more than they used to initially. And I do think, like I said, that they're responding to some of our complaints. So LAUC was very reactive, and it wasn't very. We weren't given a lot of input in the beginning, and we might have been able to avoid some of this if they really wanted to listen to us.
Or if we had spoken up. I think that's another thing, is I wish we would have interviewed people more, and I think we could have done that, but we didn't necessarily.
Yeah, in hindsight, that makes a lot of sense. It's hard to know exactly when that would have been at the time, but yeah, you're right. It would have been. There might have been a chance for us to say, hold on, but yeah, it's interesting to know that. One other last note, we have something called Library Council, which is each of those people in those boxes meets once a month and discusses managerial stuff, and they're generally open to anyone who wants to come and sit in on it. Added to that group of Library Council is the chair of LAUC, and they added that as a person to sit at the table, mostly to report back things, but if it makes sense, they can bring stuff to the council as well for consideration, or so forth. And I was the first lucky one to be able to sit with that, and I'm not a program director, so that was a new role for me. And so that's another way that they've at least given LAUC a little seat at the table. So that's, hopefully it'll be helpful as we go forward too. So last thing for Cristela to wrap up the climate wall.
Okay, so I'll just briefly touch on the climate call stuff, and then if you have questions about it, we can always talk a little bit more. But as if that wasn't enough, going through the reorg, we also were going through the climate call survey. And so just briefly to tell you what that is, it's an online survey distributed by the Association of Research Libraries to assess staff, library staff perceptions concerning the commitment to principles of diversity, organizational policies and procedures, and staff attitudes. The survey addressed a number of climate issues such as justice, leadership, diversity, teamwork, learning and fairness, as well as current managerial practices, job satisfaction, organizational commitment, empowerment, interpersonal conflict, and engagement. So a lot of big words, but basically when I first heard that we were doing it as we were going through the reorganization, I thought, well, that's maybe not the best time because of course everyone's feeling frustrated and a little uneasy. But now that I look back on it in retrospect, I actually think that it was a really good motivator for a lot of conversations that we might not have had if had they not been going on in parallel. So again, I won't go into too many details, but we did, again, we did score high on certain things that I'm actually very proud of, things like innovation, continual learning, organizational commitment. I think we have a really strong, dedicated staff at UC San Diego that I enjoy working with, and so it was kind of a, how can we hang on to those great things when we struggle with things like a lot of the distributive, procedural, and information justice, psychological empowerment, and structural facilitation of teamwork. Those are all areas that we scored lower on. So this was actually a good way for us to like address some of those issues and look at it. So the survey was carried out. There was a survey team that did that, and they also did the analysis of the initial results and gave some recommended next steps. And then after that team did that, they passed over the work to an implementation team, which is what Gayatri and I were a part of. And both teams were made up of both library and non-library staff members. And so again, that was also, I think, important to have voices from many different perspectives. And again, just to give you a little brief overview, this is just a diagram that shows the areas that we really tried to focus in. So a lot of what the survey results told us, there were issues with compensation and classification, supervision, and which we wanted to broaden to leadership, and then diversity. And so these were areas that we focused in on. And this diagram kind of shows you that the more we were thinking about these sorts of things separately, and we did like open sessions where we talked about each of these individually and talked about what we were looking at as recommended next steps and kind of teased out details, we really started to see that they're all very intertwined and overlap quite a bit, and that there's also some correlations or common threads with communication, mentoring, morale, and then also a need for continual assessment, not just one-time assessment. And this also ties to things that are happening not just within our library, but also within the UC system and on campus. So we were kind of trying to look at that and put it all in perspective. And again, due to time, I won't go into too many details, but we did end up with a set of 15 recommendations that were tied to each of these areas that we sort of were looking at. And we've, over the course of the last year, vetted this, discussed it, met with different people, talked about it, and come up with these set of recommendations. And we just recently heard back from our administrative team, which is our UL and our 3 AULs, and they have addressed each of these recommendations. We are going forward in a lot of different directions, and we're just starting to implement changes now, so we'll have to see. We're also going to do another 6-month status check with this work to kind of see where we're going and what more needs to be done. And then just to kind of wrap up, I think through the climate call process, but then also again with the reorg, I think one of the biggest things that we're getting out of this is that we are learning how to openly share feedback. I think it's been really important that this dialogue has started to happen. I don't think it was happening in the beginning of the process, but it's something that we're really pushing towards now. And there's been a lot of value in those exchanges. So again, some of the things that Dave was mentioning, the town halls, the weekly updates that we're now receiving. So there is this sort of constant need for communication and also for morale. I think that was one thing that it took a little while for our upper management to kind of recognize that morale is important, and it's not just something, it's actually very significant to getting people to embrace change and move forward. So I'm happy to say that I think that is kind of changing. We are starting to see some of those changes, and just overall in the climate, has improved. But I think it's been through these sorts of like conscious discussions that we've been having, and I feel like we've had to learn how to insert ourselves into some processes and conversations that wouldn't naturally include us, but I think we've had to become people at the table. So I'll stop there. But if you have any questions about this, I do have the reports and the numbers and all that if you wanna learn more about that.
Thank you so much, Dave and Cristela. Up next is Alan, UC Santa Barbara.
I'm honored to be part of this panel on reorganizations, or what I like to call organizational realignments. As an undergraduate, I was a philosophy major, so you will please indulge me if I wax philosophical for a bit or even stray into semantics. But I've long held the belief that organizational realignment should be based upon policies and principles and not upon politics or personalities. But nonetheless, sometimes the latter, politics and personalities, changes do end up being based on those because they're necessary. And I'll talk a little bit about all of those at UC Santa Barbara. So I prefer the term organizational realignment over terms like reorganization or even organizational restructuring. Organizational restructuring makes me think of playing with blocks. Reorganization makes me think about rearranging books on shelves. And for me, organizational realignment is more about organizational health. If you think of one of Raghunathan's laws, a library is a growing organism. So I think about the health of the organization and the roles in which organizational realignment helps improve the health of an organization. It makes me think of chiropractic adjustments, for instance. You can have an individual, and I was one, can be in a car accident and have severe back pain. I remember my mom taking me to the doctor, and he suggested surgery on my back. She was like, oh, hold on, slow down. And she took me to a chiropractor, worked out much better. It was a painful experience being adjusted by the chiropractor, but it was small adjustments that helped me over time. And more recently, I've started doing circuit training to build up my core, using all the muscles to work together to align my body better. So just in the same sort of way, that's my approach to organizational realignments. So, a little more specifics about UCSB. Denise Stevens arrived as the University Librarian in July of 2011 after a period of intense change in the leadership in the admin suite. There had been, during the previous 8 years, 5 ULs, whether acting or recruited. There was a rapid change. There had been severe budget cuts for more than the previous decade. From the 90s, there had been severe budget cuts. And there had been attrition to the staff. There had been retirements that had never been filled. Even upon my arrival a year later, there were still many, many vacancies that had not been filled for 5, 10, 15 years. The organization was in great need of some sort of adjustment to it, maybe even ralphing, something even more intense than chiropractic care. Or maybe even surgery. Denise admitted that upon her arrival, looking at it, she was wondering if a radical reorganization, using her terms, is what was needed. But her assessment of the morale was such that she didn't think that would be in the best interest to do something radical. that while people's spirits were pretty good and hopeful for the future, they've been worn down by years, if not decades, of trauma. And she didn't want to add to the trauma. But nonetheless, changes needed to be made. So one of the first changes that she made was fairly minor. It was just a renaming of the public services AUL position to research and scholar services. So giving a different emphasis for one division. The next adjustment was a little bit more substantial. It was still at the AUL level. My predecessor was the AUL for Human Resources. She envisioned a Deputy University Librarian position that was responsible for HR, but also assessment, and also planning, and also training. So taking an organization development approach to it instead of just a narrow approach of HR. Again, this didn't affect the organization much as a whole in reporting lines, but it was a significant change to the culture of the library by taking this different approach. And now I haven't been following along with my notes, so now I gotta look to see what I want to talk about next. Hold on a second. So the next thing that Denise did was create a new division, an AUL for Information Technologies and Digital Initiatives. Previous to that, we had only had a director providing help desk services, and the Digital Initiatives program was kind of an ad hoc add-on. And so we hired an AUL for Information Technologies and Digital Initiatives. We had, upon Denise's arrival, 2 department heads that were serving as acting co-leads for collection services, so cataloging, metadata services, acquisitions, resource management services. And we had no one for collection at the leadership level for collection development. And so there she did something that, in consultation with the librarians who are directly affected with the reports that would be changing, created new collection services that included not only the more traditional technical services, but also collection development and a newly created scholarly communications program. So pulling all of those things together under one acting AUL. So that was one of the bigger changes, but it was done in consultation with those affected. It wasn't more broadly done, and that is something that I would have preferred to have done. But at the time, and again, going back to the model of the health of a body, core training, building up one's core, would be a more participative process, more inclusive. And at the time, we weren't sure if the organization was ready for a long participative process. That we needed to make some changes, we needed to make them quick, and go forward. So in that case, we did not do broader consultation than those directly affected. Since, and this was about a year ago, since then, due to some of the politics of the departments, and particularly the lack of maturity of the Information Technology and Digital Initiatives program that the library had, it was newly created based upon